This is a story with an open ending, but what it describes will make you shiver. There were days when you couldn't leave the yard. There were about 10 such days a month. It was not easy for me personally to recognize such days, but the adults guessed them by some of their own adult signs. On such days, life went on as usual. Everyone had fun, talked loudly, played games. Grandpa and Dad took out chess, checkers, bingo, cards, turned on concerts on TV. Mom and Grandma cooked especially delicious meals, and we ate in the yard under the big cherry tree. But there was something contrived, tense about all this festivity. Grandma and Mom walked around pale, with strained smiles. They talked about good things, but their eyes were running. Dad and Grandpa tried to joke, but all the jokes were awkward and not funny. When they needed to get out of the yard in the car on days like this, which was the only safe way to get out at that time, they prepared for it, long, somber, and somehow sad. It made me sad that I wouldn't see my friends for 10 whole days. I even tried to disobey the rules somehow and sneak out of the yard. What could happen? I didn't make it out of the yard. My mom saw me in time, and my dad gave me a good belt for it. That was the only time in my life I ever got hit. I didn't try my luck anymore and entertained myself with everything that was within the radius of our yard, from the vegetable garden to the gate. I did not know why it was impossible to go out as a child, and after the whipping, I did not want to ask. But from my parents' half-voiced conversations in the kitchen, I understood that there was someone out there. And it is not the usual for rural areas, dogs or wolves, but someone else. From the age of 10, wicket fences have also become a forbidden zone for me, and the belt had nothing to do with it. That day, my ball rolled towards the wicket, and I ran after it. I remembered that it was forbidden to leave the yard right now, but I wasn't going to do that. I just had to pick up the ball that had rolled to the fence. And it was such a nice day. The birds were singing, the sun was shining, so I didn't think about bad things. I ran to the fence, grabbed the ball lurking at the gate, and was about to give a run back into the yard as I saw that just behind the fence stands a girl in a scarf tied under the chin, and from under the forehead looks at me. I was so taken aback by her evil stare that I froze in place, surprised not even by the fact that she came out of her yard to the street on such a day, and not by the fact that for some reason she was standing outside our fence and peering into our yard, but by the strange hatred in her eyes for a child. And the longer I looked at her, the uglier her face seemed to me, and I realized it wasn't a girl at all, but some smaller than me, 10 years tall, ugly old woman. "Max, what is it?" shouted the mom who looked out of the window. I stepped out from behind the chainmail, turned abruptly and ran into the house, cradling the ball. As I ran, I managed to see my mom staring intently and tensely at the wicket. When I ran into my parents' room, she was still standing at the window. I threw myself into her arms and rushed in. There was some strange grandmother looking into our yard, but I could hear her heart beating hard, and I remembered how she had looked at the wicket as I ran away, and I realized that she had seen everything. After this incident, nothing like this happened for a long time, but for 10 days every month, I still avoided going near the wicket and generally tried to play only on the patch in the middle of the yard. Pretty quickly, I noticed that all my family members were doing the same thing. They don't tear apples and pears on those trees that grow near the fence. They don't cut roses and grapes growing near the gate. Or rather, they did. but only when the 10 days were up and they could walk the streets and play wherever they wanted again. Thus, for 2/3 of the month, life went on as usual. We went to school, walked in the streets, fished in the river, picked mushrooms in the forest, and for another third, we sat in our backyards. Only those who had cars could get out of the yard. As long as you're in the car, you're safe. But when on such days I asked my father and grandfather to go somewhere with me, they frowned and said that I could see all sorts of things. What exactly all sorts of things, I realized at 14. Usually in these 10 days, my mother and grandmother did not leave the yard, but quietly worked in the vegetable garden to this very yard adjacent to the yard. Then they gave that up too. It happened after we saw the grandmother there. We were having dinner in the yard when I heard some strange sounds, as if a cat was trying to burp a lump of hair, and I saw everyone looking somewhere behind me with square eyes. I turned around and saw a bent-in-half grandmother walking through our vegetable garden, shuddering as if trying to hold back her gagging. After walking a couple more steps, she sharply put her hands on her knees and threw up her own intestines right on our strawberries. After throwing up about 2 feet of her own intestines, she pulled up her skirt, crouched over the bed, and another part of her bowels came out. Then she stood up, shook herself off, and slowly hobbled away. We never discussed this incident in the family. We avoided it as something indecent. There were some other incidents. For example, I remember how we sat in the yard until dark, and then there was a loud knock on the gate. When I turned around, I saw several people with pale faces, all short, standing behind the fence. It was too dark to see in detail, but I could see that one of them had his head between the cracks in the fence and was smiling. Just don't look at them. They won't be able to get in on their own. My mom explained to me, and everyone continued chatting and laughing. But then, I furtively looked in that direction a few more times, and all those people were still there, climbing the fence, twisting the handle and smiling at me. There was another case in the same summer, only in July. I was picking apricots in the yard when I heard someone calling me. When I turned around, I saw Thomas, a boy 3 years older than me from the next street, standing outside the gate. It seemed strange to me. We talked to each other, but we weren't really friends, and only crossed paths in large groups. He invited me to play computer. On the one hand, I didn't want to disobey my parents. Who knows what could happen on the street these days? On the other hand, I didn't want to get in trouble in front of a big boy. Thomas smiled encouragingly, and I could see that his teeth were small and growing unevenly, one on top of the other, like 3 rows, and his eyes were black, like his, but squinted oddly, as if they were looking in different directions. I stopped. I was close enough to see that it looked like Thomas, but it wasn't him at all, and his voice sounded different, not his voice at all. I turned and rushed into the house. When I turned back, I saw that he hadn't left and was still watching me with that same strange smile. There was also a very confusing incident. I knew that if you were in a car, there was nothing to be afraid of, especially if you drove straight into the yard and then quickly closed the gate. But that didn't take away from what you could see out the window. That day, we had to go to town right away. So we went, me, Dad, and Grandpa. When we were on our way back to the house, I saw a boy walking through our yard. For some reason, he came out through the open wicket into the street and walked towards us with his back forward. We stopped. The boy passed us, I turned around and saw that it was me, smiling broadly and wearing clothes that I had never had before. Dad and Grandpa didn't see anything, or pretended not to. When we got out of the car, I turned around again and saw that the boy was still backing away from us and smiling, and he was looking right at me. The gate was locked, and when I later asked my mom if she saw anyone in our yard, she was surprised and said no. It wasn't just my doppelganger I saw. I was sitting at home one day. The heat was terrible. All the family scattered to their rooms to take a nap after dinner, and only my grandmother in the kitchen was washing dishes, and I was watching TV, and I heard some strange clucking from the window, as if a man was clucking his tongue. I looked out, and my grandfather was lying on a bench in the yard. He had his hand covering his face from the sun and was dozing. I turned my head. My grandfather was snoring in his room. Through the open door, I could see him clearly. I look out the window, and there is grandfather lying there. I went to the kitchen, told my grandmother. She was frightened and cried out. It started again, and I forgot. I dropped everything and ran to close all the windows and doors in the house. In general, it was customary for us to always close the gates to the courtyards just for this reason, even if nothing strange had happened for a long time. Because those strange people, who sometimes roamed the streets, for some reason, could not open even the most elementary wicket without a hook and latch. But if it was open, they could easily enter the yard. That was what they were usually aiming at. Strange cases happen more often in the warm season, or maybe I just remembered it that way. Only one incident I remember occurred in the winter. We were having breakfast in the kitchen when we heard someone shuffling footsteps in the yard and a loud, hoarse cough. "Someone's here," Mom said, and stood up from the table and walked to the kitchen window, where the yard was clearly visible. Immediately she yelped, turned pale, and quickly drew the curtains. I forgot to close the gate, Dad realized. Everyone jumped up from their seats and started pulling the curtains on all the windows in the house. No one went to work that day, and they wouldn't let me go to school. And we sat in front of the TV for 24 hours, drowning out footsteps, coughs, and banging on doors and windows, which, by the way, were much higher than human height because there was a garage under our house. The next morning, it all stopped. What could happen if you let yourself be lured out of your house or yard? Or meeting any of these strange people on the street? I didn't know exactly, but more than once, I heard a tragedy that happened to a girl from our village. She once lived on a neighboring street. She was walking with her child and saw something that made her run away in fear, leaving the baby in the stroller. She came home in tears. Her husband, parents, and neighbors immediately gathered together and went to the place where she had left the baby. But all they found was an empty stroller. When the search for the child was unsuccessful, the family abandoned their home and left the village. What did she see that frightened her and ran away, abandoning her baby? The parents refused to talk. In general, they didn't tell me anything about it. The only thing I understood from the conversations I listened to was that all these strange people come from the gully that starts right behind our street. If you see black smoke billowing from the gully, or you think it looks like trees are burning and falling there, it means they're going to start walking again soon. It's time to lock up the yards. And you could never keep the gate open at all, even if nothing strange had happened for a long time. On days when I could not leave the yard, I would sit on the windowsill on purpose, waiting to see something special, through the window. Often, I could see my mother or grandparents walking down the street. I could hear their voices from the next room and knew they were home. Sometimes I managed to see our relatives working in our or our neighbor's vegetable garden, who live in another settlement and who by definition could not be here. Once I saw myself knocking on the gate and calling my mother to let me into the yard. But most often, I saw fires in the girder, which, as my mother explained to me, were not really there. I saw black smoke and flames in the distance, but realized that they weren't really there, and it was an amazing feeling. I also saw a black car driving through the streets, but more often than not on the bulk. When it drove by our house, I could see that there was no one in it. It had been a long time since anything strange had happened then, and children played freely in the streets. My friends and I even went to that very girder, but we didn't find anything interesting there. Many people thought that everything was over, and then that black car, without a driver, suddenly appeared. It drove at full speed into the playing company of kids, hit 2 little boys, and disappeared. If before that people somehow tolerated what was happening, not wanting to leave their homes, then the death of the children was the last straw. My mom had already given birth to my little brother, and it was decided to change the place of residence for the safety of the baby. However, it took us a year, and for a long time, we were still on the nerves of boys hit by cars, walking on the streets after their funerals, and calling my brother to go out for a walk. But eventually, we managed to leave the place. I can say that the incidents described did not affect my psyche. At the age of 17, thanks to some benefits and, in fact, good studies, I was able to enter the budget in the university, thanks to which I was allocated a room in the city dormitory. My father eventually managed to find a good job in the same city, so my parents and my brother soon followed my example. Grandpa, unfortunately, is no longer alive, but according to my grandmother, it is hardly felt. She still sometimes sees him sleeping in the yard or sees him from the window walking down the street. So she is not lonely